Hello, welcome to another Stukent expert session. My name is Trevor Erickson, and today we're thrilled to have Kate Morris with us from Outspoken Media. Kate has over a decade of digital marketing experience and has a huge passion for growing brands online. More specifically, she has a huge passion for international SEO and getting brands in front of people, not just locally, but globally. So without any further ado, let's turn the time over to Kate and get this show started.
All right, thank you so much for that, Trevor. Welcome, everybody. I know you guys are all listening to this in various places. Today, we're going to be talking about the basics of international SEO expansion. My name is Kate Morris. I work with Outspoken Media. I have been doing this for about 12 years, and international is a topic near and dear to my heart because I got into working at one of my former companies, Distilled, and I got into a number of situations where I got asked to give insight on how to expand internationally, and it was a very, very confusing area of SEO. And so I spent years researching, looking at different situations, and came out with a serious love of international SEO. So what I want to do today is show you how to deal with what I dealt with. And what I think this could look like for you in the future is you get out of school and you're hired as a digital marketer for a great startup. They have had a great run. They might have IPO, they might not have, but the CMO comes to you and has this goal for the company to expand the reach of the company internationally. And talking about this big company goal, and you're all about it because you think the world needs to hear about this company and their products or services. So you go in and you check Google Analytics and you check your internal sales tools because, by the way, most of the tracking that's done for most companies today is internal. There are a lot of great tools on the market, but once companies kind of grow up, they start doing it themselves. But you go in and check it out, and you say that you see that you're already getting international orders. So it's kind of already happening. This is fantastic. All you've got to do is take all of the content on your site, get it translated, throw it into Google Translate, and this is going to be really easy. But I'm going to stop you right there because it's not actually really easy. International business and marketing is actually really difficult. There's a lot of stuff that goes into expanding internationally, and you have to think about it as if you want to take a store, a little mom and pop shop, and it does really well, and they want to expand into Canada and into Mexico and into the UK. There's going to be a lot of work that goes into that. It's not just about the languages. It's not just about how you work, how you set up the site. It's about how you develop your message, if it needs to change depending on the country. And so that's really the root of what we're going to get into today. So what we're going to start with, and this is the actual first thing I start with for every single client, and that's understanding languages and countries. This first slide is going to sound really ridiculous, and I'm sorry, but I have to state this so many times. A language is not a country, and a country is not a language, but many people actually equate the two, especially if you're talking about engineers at Bing or Google that want to tell you how to set up your website to show a translation in German. Germany and German, Japanese, Japan, French, France. A lot of the major world languages associate directly with one country, but they're not the same. And there are a handful of languages that are actually spoken worldwide in a number of countries, not just the country that it's named for. And so this is why I have to dig in and make sure everybody understands at the beginning that languages and countries are not the same thing. Once you grab onto that, the rest of this actually gets fairly easy, but you have to grab onto that. So I'm going to go through a couple of definitions first. What I talk about when I talk about language is the language someone prefers to browse the web in. They can actually be bilingual, trilingual, whatever else. This is their preferred language, and typically is only signified by their browser settings and search terms. So you can't determine language by IP address. You can't determine language by where the person is in the world. This has to come by what they actually do. Some of the related terms that you'll hear are translation, and that's taking content and having it translated into another language. We're going to talk about hreflang, which is Google's markup that shows to them that a page has been translated, and the meta language tag, that's Bing's preferred markup, that again shows that a page has been translated. Then we have countries. This is the physical location of a searcher. It can be where they are currently or where they prefer to search from. And what I mean by where they prefer to search from is when in the UK, Americans will actually go to the laptop that they have or a computer that they're borrowing, and they'll go in and they'll type in google.com. They won't go in and type google.co.uk, but they'll physically be in the UK. So they prefer to search from the United States because they're American, but they might actually be in the UK. Now, location is detectable via browser settings, IP address, referring search engine, or what I call other location settings, like if the user is using a mobile phone. You can possibly detect, if you ask permission, where they are using the GBS inside of their phone. A couple of related terms that we'll talk about include geotargeting, which is targeting a specific set of content to a particular country's inhabitants, and CCTLDs, and that's country-specific top-level domains. That's a .co.uk or a .de. Now, search engines operate by country. There's Google Spain, but there's not Google Spanish. You can search in Spanish in absolutely any Google property you want to, and you will get results, and some of them actually might be from companies in Spain. But you could be doing the search in google.com, and you could actually be residing in the United States. You can change your preferred language, and you can search in any language, but your location stays the same. So this is very important to understand that search engines operate by country, not by region, not by metro area, not by state. They absolutely operate on a country basis. So you won't be able to geo-target to the Middle East. You won't be able to geo-target to North America. You actually have to geo-target to countries. You also can't geo-target to states. And I'm talking about organic search. We're not talking about PPC. We're talking about organic search right now. So keep in mind that search engines operate by country. And the other thing to keep in mind is that regional differences matter. Now, what I mean by this is that the laws in the UK pertaining to websites and commerce on the web, they all vary by country. If you go visit a website that is based in the UK, you will get a little pop-up that says, "We are setting a cookie. Please click OK if you accept this cookie, or no if you don't, and we won't put a cookie down." That is something that they have to do in the UK. We don't have to do here in the US. So there are lots of different laws and rules. There's currency, which everybody understands, but then there's also cultural differences. One of the things, an example that might kind of drive this home is if you have a custom card printing company in the US that wants to expand to Australia, they can't use the US images of Christmas cards because Christmas cards in Australia are not cold. Christmas cards in Australia feature the beach, feature Santa in the sand, because it's the summer for them. They also can't use US Mother's Day cards because Australians say mum, not mom, and they really don't like the word mom. So that's just a look at the basis, the languages and countries that we're really gonna dive deep into. This next part is the part that everybody wants to know when they talk about international search expansion, is how do we set up our sites? This is not where to start, but this is where everybody wants to start. So I'm going to show you a couple of the more technical things, and then the third section I'm going to teach you how to determine what people should do. So first, a couple of terms that you should know. The first one is XML sitemap. It's a sitemap written in XML that is submitted to search engines and allows them to see all the important URLs for a site. I'm pretty sure all of you know what a URL is, but I threw that one in there. Then there's a canonical tag. A canonical tag is a header tag that if a page is an exact duplicate of another page, then it points to the original page saying this page is a duplicate of that page. The canonical tag was originally developed for the news industry because different newspapers needed to print the same stories online, but it was actually from another paper. And then the last thing is a parameter. Now, I stole this definition from somebody else because it was really hard to figure out how to define this. But parameters are values that set dynamically a page's URL and accesses different information to put on that page. It's a little bit of code at the end of the URL that changes some of the page's information. I will show you what I mean by this a little bit later. So the first thing everybody wants to know about when it comes to international expansion is how do you set up the URLs? You should not start with this. Do not start with this, but I wanted to show you what the options were. And I'm going to tell you why it's really hard to start with this. So for your language options, you can have that parameter at the end. So ! language equals EN. You don't have to use lang. The actual parameter can be whatever your developer so desires to use. But that's one option. The second option is a subdirectory. That is typically the preferred way of doing it. And then there's a subdomain. I don't recommend subdomains for language translations. It's just a little weird, so I'm just going to throw it out there. It's not the best way to go about it. And then when you're geo-targeting, you have three options. A ccTLD, which we talked about earlier, a subdirectory, just like you have the subdirectory option over up in languages, and then a subdomain. Now, subdomains are much more common when it comes to geo-targeting. It makes sense to have a subdomain targeted to a country rather than a subdomain targeted to a language. Now, the reason why you don't want to pick this too early is because if you do it too early and you make the wrong decisions, it can force you to change your URLs later. For example, if a company starts with translations, I will explain a little bit of this, of why they might have started there a little bit later on. But let's say they started with translations via subdirectories to start with. So they went English, French, Spanish, German, picked 6 of the main languages. But then they want to add country-specific targeting. They realized that just translating wasn't what they needed. They actually needed to have content specifically targeted to Canada. Well, if they do that, if you use subdirectories for both of them, you have to change the URLs because the location always has to come first. And that has to do with geo-targeting inside of Google and Bing Webmaster Tools. So just know that location should always come first if you decide to use country and language targeting via subdirectories. Now, with our two options, we have country targeting and we have translation. And I'm going to go through the technical ways of doing these two things. Again, we're going just through the technical stuff, not that you should do it. Every instance is different. So, country targeting, geo-targeting, is done only through Google Search Console, which, by the way, used to be called Webmaster Tools, is only done through Google Search Console and Bing Webmaster Tools. It's an option that you go through and pick inside of there. I've included instructions for both Google and Bing, but know that if you ever decide to use a ccTLD, those are automatically targeted to the countries that it's assigned. So if you launch a domain, domain.co.uk, it'll automatically be geo-targeted to the UK. The upside is that you don't have to do anything. The downside is that you can't then use that domain to target other countries. So if you have a .fr, you can't then geo-target a subdirectory of that .fr to the United States. It's only for that country. Language targeting, on the technical basis, Google uses a tag called hreflang, and it can be placed on page or in an XML sitemap, and Bing uses the meta language tag. It can only be placed on the page. My warning to you here is that language targeting tags should only be used when the content is identical, just translated. That's what they're for. hreflang is Google's tag, and I'm not going to go through absolutely all of this, but what I want to do is give you a look at what you have to go through to deal with hreflang. So the code, depending on if you want to do it inside of a sitemap or on the page, the code is going to have to reference the current page in all translations at all times. So let's pretend you have this new page and you have it available in 3 languages, English, French, and German. These are your URLs. If you went with on page, for each page, if you were on the English page, you would have to reference the English page and the other 2 translations. On the French page, the same thing. Basically, you're copying the code. It makes it really easy for your developers. However, it does put potentially puts a lot of code on the page. So I prefer to put everything into an XML sitemap. It pulls the code off of the page and allows you to deal with things on the back end rather than the front end. Now, the issue here is that you have to, inside of these sitemaps, you have to list every single page. So you have to list the English version, the French version, the German version, and you have to list them individually. Well, once you list them, you have to use the hreflang tag to list all possible translations, including itself. So it gets to be a little redundant, but trust me, if you have this in your sitemap, it's a lot easier to deal with. And the Bing meta-language tag is very easy. It goes in the head of every page and specifies the language that the page is in. It's pretty simple and straightforward. Now, this is where a lot of people get very confused, because hreflang and meta-language allow you to specify a language dash a country, and they think that it's a way to geo-target, when in fact, I think it's GB, sorry guys. I do UK and GB differently all the time. It's meant to specify that you're translating to a region-specific dialect. For instance, I don't know if you guys have ever noticed, but UK and American English are completely different. If you've ever tried to listen to a British person, I've been at parties before where they are having conversations and they're speaking my language, but I have no idea what they're saying. There are vast differences between the 2 languages. It's not necessarily always true, but it can be true. So that language dash country thing was meant to show that you were translating between the regional dialects of a specific language, but it's only meant to be translating. If you ever realize that the content needs to change to target the country, that's when it needs to be geo-targeted. Now I'm going to give you an example. I didn't mean to pick out this example, but it was the best one I could find when I was looking. Grass City does this perfectly. So they have grasscity.com/en underscore /US underscore en. That is actually reversed. You should start with the language first, but I'm not picking on them. If you compare that to their UK page, which I just changed slides, I promise I did. I'm going to go back to the US and back to the UK. They are almost identical, absolutely almost identical. This is a great use of hreflang because they might have changed a couple of words between some of their pages, but that's all they did. Their products are the same, their offerings are the same. They just changed the language a little bit. If you compare that with Nielsen, Nielsen has an incorrect setup. They use hreflang, but I don't think they mean to. This is their US-focused homepage. And if you move it over to the UK, you'll see that they have different content, and you'll see that they have that cookies thing I was talking about earlier. So they're actually changing the content to target the UK audience. So they don't need hreflang. They didn't take the same content and translate it. They actually changed the content. And that's what I mean by changing the content to focus on the country. So I'm going to make this as clear as I can, because trust me, a lot of people have a hard time with this. If you've targeted or changed the content for the country other than translated, you don't need language markup. You need geo-targeting. And that's going to lead into our next section, which is figuring out which one of these things you need to do. I, after years of trying to figure all of this out, finally realized that in talking to lots of different clients, I was asking the same questions. So I wrote out those questions and tried to make it into this handy-dandy flowchart. If you guys ever are interested, come back to this session, take a look at this flowchart, and it runs you through a set of questions that will lead you to the answer. Should the client geo-target? Should they translate only? Should they do both of them? And it all runs down to what do they need and what resources do they have? Basically, what do their end users need? Now, I've broken this down into a couple of bullet points on the next slide, and it sort of simplifies what we're doing with that flowchart. The first thing you have to figure out is there a reason for different people in different countries to see different products, services, or data? If this is true, if somebody in the UK and somebody in the US trying to buy from one company needs to see a different set of products, then they probably need to geo-target. If not, if the content is going to stay exactly the same, software typically does this. If the content's exactly the same, they probably just need to translate. And in fact, translation can be a really quick way of getting lots of traffic from people across the world, assuming that that you can actually sell to those people. Once you've determined that, you need to see if there's a need for translations inside of specific country sites. For example, Canada has two official languages, French and English. And most companies in Canada offer their information in both languages. Switzerland has 4 official languages. India, I believe, has 11. So there are countries that have more than one official language, and if you're targeting one that has more than one official language, you might have to use hreflang between the translations inside of one country's specific subsite. We'll go into this in a little bit deeper. And then finally, the last thing that we have to do in that whole flowchart is identify what resources are available. If the company doesn't have the resources to do translations or maintain different sites for specific countries, we don't want to say that they should do translations or that they should geo-target. If they don't have the resources, please don't recommend that they continue doing this. And because that is all so very confusing, and I presented this a couple of years ago, we made a tool. So we took that flowchart and we actually made a tool that will ask you one question at a time, lead you through, and then take you to one of the 3 quote-unquote answers. And these are the 3 answers. I'm going to go over these 3 fairly quickly. But it gives you that plus all of the technical stuff that I've already talked about. So this tool makes it very, very easy on you. I definitely recommend going and checking it out. I'm going to go back. It's outspokenmedia.com/international SEO strategy. So with translation only, this is for companies that don't need to geo-target. Their site would remain exactly the same no matter the user's country. For example, software makers, app developers, they don't need different content for people in different countries. Translation allows for the biggest impact with the least effort. If you were to translate content into the top 8 languages, it reaches 80% of the world's population. That's a pretty big impact. One of the things to keep in mind if a company goes down the route of translation is that CCTLDs are not used when you're just translating. CCTLDs are only for when you're changing content to focus on that particular user's country. So keep that in mind because a lot of people mess that up. And my last thing is that translation should always be done by human beings and never by a machine. If you're curious what I'm talking about, go find a page in a different language and translate it into English, and I promise you it'll be one of the hardest things to read in the world. Google Translate and any other machine translation is just not a great user experience. It's not going to be good for whatever company you're working for in the future. Just don't do it. Now, for an example of translation only, let's say you're working with a lawyer based in the US. They are local to one country. They're not leaving that country. And you can't do geo-targeting for states. So they're going to stay in the United States. But let's say that this lawyer decides he wants to offer his site in Spanish. The best route for him would not be to buy his domain .es, because that would be showing that you are trying to open offices in Spain. Instead, what you would do is translate the content into Spanish and offer it at different URLs. So I have a couple of instances down there. One is what most people do, which is just throwing it into a subdirectory called ES, and they just keep the rest of it the same. Your second option is to actually translate the page names as well. That would be great, but don't feel like you have to. A lot of people understand. And I apologize to anybody that speaks Spanish. I translated that with Google Translate. Do as I say, not as I do. All right, so the next one is geo-targeting only. This option is for companies who have differences in content depending on where the user is located. For example, a former client, Precor, they offer different machines. They do exercise machines. They offer different machines in different countries, as well as different business services. So they actually have to change their content depending on where the user lives. Each content section or site, if you do a CCTLD, it's a separate site, needs to be made to target that specific area. You should not ever open up .co.uk, take your .com, and throw it over there and copy it directly. It's not going to work out well because it's duplicate content. It's not going to cause problems. You won't get penalized for it, but it won't rank very well because it's a brand new domain with duplicated content. Your .com is always going to outrank that. Now, your changes don't have to be complete changes, but they do need to be changes. Trust me, search engines get that some of your product descriptions are going to be the same, but your content shouldn't be exactly the same. For example, let's say that you started this and realized that the only thing that you're changing, you're not removing products, you're not adding products, the only thing you're doing is changing the language. You really should just translate. So we're going to go back to the US-based car printer. After researching that market, this is based on a client, we realized that the company needs to create specific content to each country, aka Australia. So while not all of their content changes, they have lots of content that's going to stay exactly the same, they will need to change the content based on the user's location due to different things. So it's more than translation. This particular instance, they're only focusing on countries that speak English, so there's no translation necessary, and they're only working within countries, and they're only going to offer one language. So they really only need geo-targeting. But that's one good example. And the final one is geo-targeting and translating. Typically, this is for large companies that do business all over the world and have a need for country-specific sites that have multiple languages. Now, we talked about Canada. We talked about Switzerland. For instance, Germany is right next to France, and there are some people in Germany that speak French as their primary language. If you did a German subdirectory site, you would have /de/en as your English, /de/fr as translations. Your tags, your translated tags would go between those and not to a France-specific subdirectory. Another way to look at that is if you had a Canadian CCTLD, so you had domain.ca, it should have language translation tags between the English and the French, but it would not have language tags between the main domain, domain.com, or if they had a .fr for France, they wouldn't use language tags between domain.ca and domain.fr. Those are two geo-targeted things, not translated things. This one, if your head is swimming, I'm sorry, it's the hardest one to understand. And this is actually what most sites mess up, and what big sites mess up today. Using hreflang between, I will tell you that this will not hurt the site. If you use hreflang between geo-targeted sections like CCTLDs, it won't hurt. It's just not technically correct. So if you join a company that's doing it wrong, it's not hurting them. It's just not the best It's just not the most optimized. We'll put it that way. And I'm going to fly through this one a little bit because I think we've talked about it a lot. Sorry, guys. This is the U.S. card printer. If they decided after moving into Canada that they wanted then to grow from English to English and French, they would not only geo-target the /ca, they would also use hreflang between the original English and the Canadian French. hreflang is added here to tell the search engines that the content, that the English targeted content to Canada is now also in French, but it's still targeted to Canada. So I have a few last things for you. These are some of the most common international issues that I come across, and you will have heard of most of these already. Confusing language and country. Absolutely the most common thing I come across, largely to do with the issues with Portuguese, Spanish, French, and German. The most common languages typically have more than one associated country unless you're talking about the Asian languages. So Chinese is typically only spoken in China, and Japanese is typically only spoken in Japan. Second thing is poor translations. I won't harp on this too much. Don't machine translate. Just don't. Pretty please, never do it. Thank you. Incorrect or missing hreflang code. Now this is largely due to technicalities or somebody not, the developer not understanding the difference between countries and languages. Sadly, there's not much to help you on the market to set up sitemaps. So you have to check Search Console to see if anything is set up incorrectly or if there are any errors. And I'm going to show you an example. This is inside of Search Console, and it will show you how many tags you have and how many of those tags have errors. So Google's great and tells you exactly what's going wrong, where that problem is, and I think they show you how to fix it as well. The other thing that people run into is not geo-targeting correctly. Lots of people think they are, and they don't actually take the time to set it up. This is, again, inside of Search Console, under the International Targeting section, the Country tab. If they're supposed to be targeting a country, that little checkbox should be checked, and there should be a country selected. And finally, the last thing we come across is duplicated content. A lot of people start with international expansion, and they launch all of these CCTLDs, and they duplicate all of their content, and then they can't figure out why it's not ranking very well. It's largely because of duplicated content. My whole thing is that if the company doesn't have the resources to change the content, they should wait to expand. International expansion is supposed to be something that is supposed to take time. It's supposed to be an investment. So make sure that whatever company you work for in the future, if they want to expand internationally, they're taking the time to understand the market, and they're taking the time to really dedicate the resources to that expansion. So that is everything I have for you today. I think there are a couple of questions, so I'm going to move over to the questions after I get a quick swig of water. By the way, if anybody needs to contact me, there is my contact information. The first question, do you need a sitemap for each language or country? And can you have too many sitemaps on your website? You can technically have too many sitemaps on your website, but most people will never reach that. I can't remember the exact limits, but it's something like 50,000 sitemaps. And within the 50,000 sitemaps, you can have 50,000 URLs. That's a lot of content, so most likely you're not going to reach that. You do have to have you should, you don't have to. Sitemaps are merely suggestions. They are maps to search engines. They are helpful in getting them to all of the content you think is important. So you don't have to have them, but they're very helpful. I highly recommend a different sitemap for each language and a different sitemap for each country. And if you happen to have different languages inside of one country, I highly recommend having one sitemap per combination. This is to make sure that you are being indexed correctly, that there isn't an issue with markup, and for the data nerd in me, it lets you see if there are specific instances within each country type thing. So yes, I'm not going to say you need it, but it is highly, highly recommended. The second question is, would you have to ask, would you ever use a WordPress plugin to translate a website on the WordPress platform? If so, which plugin? No, absolutely not. I'm sorry, no. I would not recommend a plugin to translate a website. I've never seen a good plugin, and usually when you're working for a company that's trying to make money off of a site, you don't ever want translations gone wrong. So if you are going to expand internationally, definitely take the time to hire somebody that is fluent, absolutely fluent in that language, to have them translate your content. It's just not recommended, and I'm sorry, I refuse to give recommendations for plugins. And I think that is all of the questions that we have. So it was wonderful talking to you guys, and I hope you have a wonderful session.
All right, thanks, Kate. Especially thanks for answering those last few questions. I have one more question for you. We like to ask this question to all of our presenters, and it's a favorite tool or resource or even a book that you're currently in love with, or something that you've recently come across. What is that?
Okay, so I'm going to have to say tool. I hate to say it, I don't read very many books to do with search very often. I was only recently introduced to the Stukent book, which is actually updated, but many of them just aren't updated enough for me. So I haven't read a lot of those. My favorite tool is Screaming Frog. So to all of the students out there, if you haven't come across Screaming Frog and you haven't ever used it yourself, I highly recommend it. Most of the analysis that I do is that it started with Screaming Frog, and it started with crawling a site. It is definitely worth the investment if they get into a company and they say, hey, what tools should we invest in? Screaming Frog should be the #1 place that you start with.
So just to give us an idea, how much roughly does that tool cost? I'm sure there's probably different levels, but...
Yeah, it's free to crawl, I think, 500 pages or something like that.
Okay.
And then I think on a monthly basis, it's a little under no, I think it's $100 for the year, maybe.
Okay.
It's actually very inexpensive.
Yeah.
Yes, it is for the year, and I think it's under $100 for the year. But it's absolutely priceless when it comes to identifying any technical issues.
Okay, well, we'll link that up. I'm sure you're not going to forget the name Screaming Frog. Clever name.
Yep.
So we just want to thank you, Kate, for your time. This is such an awesome resource, especially one to bookmark in your browser, keep close to you, especially after you graduate, because you could come across cases like what Kate outlined in the beginning, where you're asked to be a part of a global international expansion. And so lots of good news in here, and we just want to let Kate know that we're grateful for her time, and to make sure you give her a follow on Twitter @Kate Morris. So Kate, thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.